Thank you so much for coming out to our presentation. The capital crime of witchcraft, what the primary sources tell us? Right?
Yes.
The whole title? All right. Yeah, presented by Margo Burns, yes?
Yep.
And with help from the humanities, who did that? Oh, it landed over there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, provided through a grant from the Humanities Council. So Margo Burns is the 10th generation great-granddaughter of Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged in Salem in 1692 on the charge of witchcraft. She is the project manager and associate editor of the Records of the Salem Witch Hunt, published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press. This work is the definitive collection of transcriptions of the legal records of the episode. Burns recently retired from St. Paul School as the director of the Language Center.
I had had that changed, had to call the humanities. No, you can't say I'm still working, I can say I'm retired. Oh, we'll fix that.
Just a small note of housekeeping, if there is any reason we need to evacuate, the closest exit is right behind you right there. And yeah, we can just head away from the building. So without any further ado, take it
Thank
away.
you, Ben. It was a cold and dark and stormy night. Actually, it's not that stormy today, so thank you all for coming out. The title is The Capital Crime of Witchcraft, one of the primary sources. I didn't write that. Humanities Council did, but this is my title. I didn't think that would go over really well. But actually, this is a talk of how they came to, you're insulting your next door neighbor, calling her that old witch, and then they hang her. How do you get from one part to the next? What was happening? And it didn't include pitchforks or torches. It had to do with paperwork. It was bureaucratic. And I've got some samples of the documents over here, but I'm going to show them on the screen. If you want to see some facsimiles and hold them like you're doing real stuff. But it was paperwork. And the reason we know what we know about these old witchcraft trials is they left a paper trail. And when you're doing history, for me at least, it's like, how do we know what we know? A lot of people know stuff that's just wrong. Oh, well, I know this. It's sort of like, yeah, show me the primary source. Because the primary source, you can interpret it in different ways. But, if they say, oh, a dog was hanged. No, we have no source that says a dog was hanged. Nope. So I always ask, how do we know what we know? And before we get to the documents, though, whenever I talk about history, I want to put everything in place and time. So let's look at a place. This is a map from 1665. It's a Belgian map. And it may look a little odd, but you can see Cape Cod, right? You can see Long Island. One of the things when you look at Long Island, it looks a little weird. We're used to that long skinny thing. But all those little inlets, this is a navigation map. So shores and riverbanks and things like that were really important. So it looks a little weird, but once you start figuring out, yeah, and here we have the Merrimack River, the Connecticut River, the Hudson River. So once you start picking out these things, you go, yeah, that's a pretty good map. I like that. The part of the map I'm going to talk about tonight is in the northeast part. And when you look at that, that looks a little chaotic too. But let's compare it to what it looks like today. And once you see that, you go, oh yeah, that really makes sense. But I really want to put us in that time. How did they see their world? But we can sort of put it together. Salem and Boston, Great Bay. I think they thought it was greater than we do. But then again, it was really an important place. They were oystering. They were doing all kinds of things. It was a very important place. So they made it bigger with more details. So let's take a look at where we are today and where you are. This is where we are today. So in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, there are a lot of little towns. And this is familiar to us. But in 1692, it looked like this. And it looks like Litchfield was part of Dunstable. This is my map from 1692. Dunstable's a really hard place to define. So don't count on that part of Dunstable being necessarily accurate. But I'm going up to this river, over that. But where we are now is really pretty much inland and didn't have too much of a connection to what was going on in the 17th century. It was probably the wilds, the Wild West out there. And all of this, the province of Maine and Massachusetts was all Massachusetts. And province of New Hampshire went back and forth. The New Hampshire, and also maybe part of Massachusetts, or maybe it's New Hampshire, but nobody's taking care of anything, so the Massachusetts courts will step in. So it's a little muddy in there. In talking about the Salem witchcraft trials that happened in 1692 and 1693, the basic story is that in the end of February, beginning of March, two little girls in the minister's household, Betty Paris, his daughter, and Abigail Williams, who was, they were like 9 and 10. And Abigail Williams is described sometimes as his niece or kinfolk. We really don't know where she came from. We don't know where she went. Claims some kind of family connection, but nobody's found any genealogical connection between them. So, but they started having just all sorts of strange behaviors in a town, well, a part of Salem, called Salem Village, and it was a farming community, not right on the coast, and it was trying to develop itself and have its own minister, so that the people in town didn't have to go all out there, didn't have to go all the way into town to go to church on Sunday. So that was kind of, as things were growing and things come apart. And Salem Village is now where Danvers is. So if you go down to visit the Rebecca Nurse Homestead or some of those things, where did this really take place? Well, you have to go to Danvers. So that's Salem Village. When I talk about the Salem witchcraft trials, people assume that the stuff that happened in the minister's household and all of that, that's Salem. And that's why it's the Salem witchcraft trials. Not so. It's the Salem witchcraft trials because the trials took place in the court in Salem proper. So, and most people just know that as those first things, because before we're through, there were 151 people who were accused of witchcraft, and most people only know about the first few. And then it's sort of like, okay, my brain's full, I get it, I know what the story is. People were acting weird, and they believed each other, and they, arrested them and put them on trial and executed them. I got it. I don't need to know all 151. But the things that were happening in Salem Village were the ones that where it was starting. All of Salem town became involved because there were people already starting to accuse people outside of the village. I hear you're taking a course. You gotta ask. You get to ask questions.
Oh, I do?
Yeah.
Okay.
You tell your teacher who you saw, they'll know who I am.
All right.
So I think. Okay, so Salem town was a much larger place and had a lot of different kinds of people. You've got the merchants, it's a very old established place. So if we think Salem witchcraft trials, people, they're gonna say, okay, just that. Well, before 1692, well, there are other things going on. So for instance, in 1691 in Chelmsford, there was a woman named Martha Sparks, who was also accused of witchcraft, but not by any of these people that we've heard of. And she was put in jail in Boston, and she was in jail with all the Salem witchcraft people, and her case was never heard. And finally, she was in jail over a year, and nobody paid any attention to her case. So that had come up a few months before. And then also over in Ipswich, a woman named Rachel Hatfield Clinton, who's generally put into the group of the Salem stuff, because hers was being heard then, she was being accused of witchcraft by another whole bunch of people. So it didn't just sort of spring out of nothing in Salem Village. There were other things going on, so there was already a sense of unease. Also, around that time, on Candlemas actually, which is January 25th, in York, the indigenous people were getting pretty fed up with the English. The English were not treating them well and taking their lands, and there was an assault on York. So this is right before the accusations in Salem were starting to come out. But they killed 100 English people and took another 80 captive up to Quebec City. So, I don't know, has anybody driven to Quebec City? It's way up there.
Far, and we're in a car.
Yeah, we're in a car, and they were in January and February, 80 people being brought all the way up there to be ransomed. They're going to make some money off of them, But this kind of thing was happening. There were a lot of assaults on the frontier, and that also was making people uneasy. If you're really interested in that, on the handout, there's a book by Mary Beth Norton called In the Devil's Snare, and she goes into that part of it in depth. And she's fabulous. She's absolutely fabulous. So there were also a lot of refugees coming down from Maine and all these other places. And we do see some of these people popping up in the records of the trials, usually as accusers. So that's going on. But before we're through, there are accusations against people in all of these towns. When you go up to Wells, there's one person, he used to be the minister in Salem Village. And, he saw the Crown's soldiers coming, and he's going, they're going to reinforce my garrison against the attack. And they went, no, you come with us. Can you imagine? So all the way up there, but all these other towns. And you'll notice there's a great big green swath through Hampton. That's because in 1692 there weren't any accusations. They'd already sort of gone through all of their people by 1680. So they go, nope, we're good, we already did that. Here in New Hampshire, nobody was ever convicted of witchcraft, and certainly no one was ever executed. So that's kind of nice. And then there are a couple of little towns in there that, maybe not big enough to have a town witch, I don't know. But there were a lot of people making all sorts of accusations. So again, the Salem witchcraft trials is just because the court was in Salem. It wasn't that that's where all the accusations were. So there we are in place. Let's go to time. In 1691, that's Martha Sparks over in Chelmsford. Around October, about this, right about now. And then when we get to 1692, back at the end of February, on February 29th, yes, it was a leap year, that's when the two little girls had started making accusations. And then other little girls, and then some teenage girls, and some adults, men and women, there were a lot of people making accusations. But that's when they first arrested 3 people. Tituba, who was an indigenous woman, probably from South America, via Barbados, came as a slave, and in the minister's household. And then 2 women named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Sarah Good was known to beg, even at the minister's house. And then Sarah Osborne, who didn't come to church all the time. You're supposed to go to church, but there were sort of like, have to go to church, and then the people who were the fully covenanted members, who went through a whole process of professions of faith and working with their ministers and getting accepted by the other people who were covenanted members. And the reprobate left after the sermons, and then they would stay for communion. So, there are 2 different layers in there. So, in those 3 months that you see in the pink, people kept being accused. In those 3 months, 70 people were accused and put in jail. Now, they were waiting for the arrival of the new governor and the new charter. That was something that sort of like, they've been waiting for like 3 or 4 years to actually get legit again. They'd lost the charter. So they were holding on for the charter to arrive so their trials could be legit. I mean, they were capital crimes. I mean, they were going to execute people. So they wanted to have it be not thrown away afterwards, said, oh, you didn't wait for us. So in that summer, in that red area, the governor established something called a court of oyer and terminer. Oyer to hear, terminer to decide. And this means it wasn't one of the regular quarterly courts or the regular superior courts that come out on a particular timetable. And it wasn't uncommon for them to have courts of oyer and terminer if something needed to be handled. And then that could just be set up. And by the time the new governor got there were 70 people in jail. And he set this up because they would just, you have to process them all, right? So when we get into the red part, that's when the court of oyer and terminer was seating. And you see there are 4 sections, and those are the times they actually had the grand juries to indict people and then convict and execute people. Now you notice the red comes a little bit farther to the right. They were considering having another one in October, but it was very cold. So they said, well, do we want to wait and for January when the regular Superior Court adjudicature will be convened, and they decided to do that. So in 1693, the court met 4 more times. They found 3 more people guilty. Most people were getting either cleared by proclamation because nobody was showing up at the grand jury. Well, okay, nobody's going to come up. And then there were a lot of people being found not guilty, but there were 3 more people who were found guilty. And I don't know if you've noticed this in the news, but there was a middle school class in North Andover, and they say the last witch, they finally have cleared the last witch. Well, it was a teenage girl in North Andover who somehow slipped through the cracks for all the reparations that had been done over the centuries. All I can think of is the next bunch of middle schoolers coming in and going, great, you made a documentary about them. What are we gonna do, you know? Yeah. They're like, oh. That's one thing, if you got one great big project, how do you reproduce it? That's one of the problems with teaching, is like, this is great. What am I gonna do with you? So this is the general thing. If you have heard, remember I like saying, how do we know what we know? Sometimes people will say, well, when the governor's wife was accused, he said, enough of this, and just sent everybody home. No. The governor could have just kept that. You know, if anything that was mentioned about his wife, nobody was going to pay any attention to that. You know, class, that wouldn't have happened. The mother-in-law of one of the other judges was named, and nothing happened about that either. So your political power really affected that. And he didn't say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, because all the people that had their cases here, if they were in jail and hadn't had anything heard, they were still in jail. If they'd been indicted by a grand jury here, but they hadn't been tried, they were still indicted. And when we started in January, that's when they just picked up everything. And then when they found the 3 people guilty in January, the chief magistrate wrote a warrant to execute them, plus a few people. There's one woman who was found guilty pregnant. They don't hang you if you're pregnant. They wait until you have your baby and then they hang you. So she hadn't been hanged. So there were about 8 people in that, and he wrote another warrant to execute them. And that's when the governor stepped in and said, you know what, we're not going to execute anybody else. There was a lot of political pushback. In Connecticut, they weren't executing people, so that just sort of put the kibosh on it. But that's what the governor did. And then it just kept going. And then this last thing in May, that's when Tituba, her case, you know, here she is arrested way back when, her case finally came before a grand jury, and they couldn't indict her. The charges were dismissed. So here's this indigenous woman, a slave, in jail that whole time. That had to have been a miserable existence. So again, I like my timelines. And in this one, each one of these lines has to do with the day that people were accused of witchcraft. And depends on how many people. So in the far left, you'll see it goes up to 3. Now, I showed you all these different towns. I didn't want to color code all the towns because then it would have been a mess up here. But I did color code Salem Village as yellow, Salem Town as green, and Andover as red, because a third of the people who were accused of witchcraft were from Andover. So, and then I get people saying, why don't you call it the Andover witchcraft trials? I said, well, you can call it the outbreak, but you can't call it the trials. So, and you sort of see it comes in two different waves of accusations. And also you see that the Salem Village and Salem Town are really in that first wave, and then you got so much more that was happening in Andover. This really tall one there at the beginning of, well, it's end of May. They're getting ready to start the court. It was going to start on June 2nd. So they were trying to do a little housekeeping, and they must have said, did we miss anybody? Because there's a warrant to arrest all these different people. We got 12 people from all these different towns. Sort of like, you know, if we're going to do this, we got to do it right. So all of these give you an idea of how things are going. When we get over here in November, I don't know if you watch Who Do You Think You Are? The first season, they had Sarah Jessica Parker. And they did her history. And in the blurbs ahead, and Sarah Jessica Parker, one of her ancestors was one of the last women accused of witchcraft in the Salem witchcraft trials. I go, which one of the 3? I'm going to guess Esther Elwell. So, I mean, I know the names, but nothing really happened to the people who were accused there. But it did still go. This is sort of like, oh yeah, we're going to accuse people. Yeah, no. So what did it take? This particular document has the complaint of the parents of some of the teenage girls, actually, against Rebecca Nurse, my ancestor. And that's the top, that's the complaint. And then this middle part is when the magistrates, there were John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, were actually giving an order to the sheriff to go and arrest her. So it's really kind of interesting that actually something like this would stick, because remember those fully covenanted members? She was a fully covenanted member, not even from the old times back in Salem town. She belonged to that church. So the fact that they would say, oh yeah, this is credible enough, we're going to go and arrest this old lady. So that's kind of, is already a little weird, because the first three people, those are usual suspects. She wasn't a usual suspect. So what they do is they send this to let's see, is this, do they call himself a sheriff? Yeah, George Harris, marshal. He gave it to him and said, apprehend Rebecca Nurse, bring her to this place, this date, this time. And so the marshal said, oh, I have brought her in. And so it's a different day, but it says, I brought Rebecca Nurse this place. And where did he have them bring them? To the meeting house in Salem Village, because this is early on and we're getting things in Salem Village. So what they did there was interrogate them. And this is an account of Martha Corey's, page 1 of 4 of these, of Martha Corey's interrogation. Now, she also was a fully covenanted member of the Salem Village Church. This should not have stuck, but it did, because John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin said, okay, you've got a complaint, we'll go arrest them and interrogate them. If you have seen depictions of the Salem witchcraft trials, where there's a judge asking questions of somebody saying, no, I'm innocent, and they're screaming girls in the corner and all that stuff, people seem to think that's the trials, but it isn't. Those are taken from these accounts of their public examinations. It's more Lenny Briscoe in the box rather than Jack McCoy in the courtroom. But it's very dramatic. You got screaming girls. And this stuff, it reads like drama. This is why Arthur Miller poached from these things, because it actually has dialogue. So in this case, she's being interrogated, and John Hathorne gives her a leading question. Tell me now why you have hurt these persons. Okay, one, it assumes that the people who are screaming are actually hurt. And then two, it assumes, well, she's done it. And I just want to know why. I mean, leading question. So what do you respond to that? She says, I do not. What else can you do? And so he goes back, who doth? I mean, he's still assuming that they are hurt and somebody is doing it. And what do you say to something like that? So she said, pray, give me leave to go to prayer. Because she was a gospel woman. She's being accused of something that she just didn't do, and it was totally antithetical to her whole life. So, let me go pray. And she said, we do not send for you to go to prayer, but tell me why you hurt these. He's back at it. And that is the case in interrogations. If this a police officer interrogating somebody, they're certain they did it. And they're going to just, confess. And she wouldn't, but finally she says, I'm an innocent person. I never had to do with witchcraft since I was born. So we get this wonderful voice coming through this. And also, our sense of justice and outrage, we know that this woman is going to hang. But we get to hear her voice, saying, I've never had to do with witchcraft since I was born. And that goes on in those 4 pages, double column. Now, how do we have this? Nobody had iPhones. Memorex wasn't around. Well, we have this because of this guy. This is Reverend Samuel Parris. And it was very common for people who were very devout in that era to go hear sermons and take notes in shorthand. Sometimes they could just, write it right out. I mean, some people were really skilled. So he showed up and he's taking these accounts down. And that's why we have these really vivid descriptions of what actually happened during these examinations. And of course they're very contentious because the people who are being interrogated are not confessing. And then the accusers are, Martha Corey, somebody threw a shoe at her and hit her in the head. This is a public interrogation. So there was chaos. But he's writing it down. And he also wrote down, and they all fell down. It's just like, it was like drama. It was amazing. I've been in a couple of documentaries. I have this to say about documentaries. Quite often it takes somebody who sort of knows a little bit, but they're not an expert, and they say, this would make a great documentary. Let's go interview people who are experts and not tell them what our story is, and then have them talk a whole lot, and then we'll take all the sound bites and put them into our thing. And I've been in a couple where they blame Samuel Parris. He's the bad guy. And I don't blame him. I know he was in the middle of everything, and I know that the nurse family ran him out of town afterwards. But I think as a young minister, the devil was real. The devil was assaulting Puritans. The devil was assaulting Massachusetts. The devil was assaulting his town, his home, his family. I'll give him a pass on trying to figure out what to do about that. I won't call him the bad guy and responsible for everything. Before we're done tonight, I'll tell you who's responsible. So once they were in custody, though, you know, they're being interrogated, they didn't let anybody go. Oh, one guy, Nehemiah Abbott Jr., he was about 18, and mostly these screaming girls, these teenagers who were getting a lot of attention from the adults, you know. I'm not as interested in why they were screaming so much as why did the adults interpret what they were saying the way they did with such consequences? Anyway, at the beginning, you know, they were claiming to be pinched and choked and hurt by specters, not by the actual person. But they would see a vision of the person coming at them and doing all this pinching and stuff. And apparently that was how witches worked. Nobody else. I mean, they're in the meeting house, and you know, there's Rebecca Nurse over on the side, and they say, "Oh, she's pinching and poking me and trying to choke me," and nobody else can see it, but all of these people who are claiming affliction could see it. Well, how do you know who it is? Well, early on, they started describing what they looked like. You know, she wore a white hood, blah, blah, blah. Well, with Nehemiah Abbott Jr., they said he had a wen on his forehead. Is anybody a Scrabble person? Crossword puzzle? A wen, W-E-N, means a bump. And they claimed that they saw a bump on his forehead. So there he was in person, and they brushed his hair aside. I mean, literally, that's in one of the documents, that they brushed his hair aside. And guess what? No wen. So the magistrate said, well, you know, if that's who was, you know, that's the image of it, it's not this guy, they let him go. After that, they wised up in their identifications. They would say, well, she said her name was Goody Martin and she was from Amesbury. Oh, really? They're identifying themselves. So at that point, they could start taking names in. You know, people were talking about, oh, this person's a witch. So they had names, and they knew what towns people were from. So that's tough. But once you're in custody, you know, they couldn't keep everybody in Salem Village. They had to move them around. Once you're in formal legal custody, they had to move you. And this is a minimus. And a minimus is a formal order to take somebody who's in custody and give them into the custody of another place. So again, we see our friends John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. And this is for moving Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, Dorothy Good. She was like the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. They coerced her to confess like you wouldn't believe. The pressure. So, hey, okay, we're going to arrest her too. Sarah Cloyce was Rebecca Nurse's sister. And then John Proctor and Elizabeth Proctor are names you probably recognize from the Crucible, but that's not their story. So they're being sent from Boston, where they've gone down there, and this is the end of May, and they're being brought up to Salem because they think these are the people they're going to try. So when you're in jail, well, there are other things, there are other documents. This is a record of the accounts from the jailer in Boston. And it has some interesting things. Chains for Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, 14 shillings.
When they returned them, or when they died, did their family get the 14 shillings back?
Well, they belong to the prison. The chains belong
so they
to the
didn't
prison.
charge those?
Well, we're getting to that.
Okay.
I'll get to that. So, and then they got 2 blankets for Sarah Good's child. That was 10 shillings. And then more shackles for 10 prisoners, £2. We have lots of documents from bills from blacksmiths saying, you know, the shackles, the fetters, the chains, all the different things that they did. They were repairing existing ones because they needed a lot of them. The fact that we actually have some of those documents is just amazing. A bill from a blacksmith for doing these things. So, but the rest of this account describes what it costs to feed them, their diet. Now, the minimus is really interesting because you can see all those people, you know, when they were transferred from Boston jail up to Salem. This, because it has the diet, tells you when they entered Boston and when they left, because they needed to have a beginning date and an end date, and then they could charge with that. Now, this was being charged to the colony. Later on, they were asking when we get to 1693, I'll have something else to say about that. But this is a bill. So trying to get all of his expenses covered. So let's move to New Hampshire. Once you're in jail, of course, you're waiting to get tried. This is a document in the case of Eunice Cole in Hampton. Has anybody heard anything about her? Yes. Well, Goody Cole, and you know, she in Hampton. She's our witch. You know, she was actually the neighbor from hell. Just the kind of person that yells and screams, and just at one point she was trying to get this, come little girl, come live with me. I mean, creepy, creepy, creepy. And clearly, you know, mental illness in the 17th century was not a pretty thing, because there really is not much help. But witchcraft, you could accuse that. Ultimately, towns ended up taking care of these people because they couldn't survive on their own. So they'd arrested her, and they put her in jail, and she was just languishing there. It was in 1673. And finally they said, okay, you have to come up with, you know, a trial for this woman. And this would have been right over in Hampton. So this is just an order, okay, let's have her trial. You like my timelines. She first appears in the legal records in about 1640 for her behavior and getting whipped in public. By 1656, she's being accused of witchcraft again, 1673 again, and in 1680, well, there are a bunch of other people being accused of witchcraft in Hampton in 1680, so it's sort of like, oh, let's bring her out again. And she died fairly soon after that, but she was never convicted. She just ended up in the records a lot. In 1680 in Hampton, there were several other people accused, including Rachel Fuller. When you have a prosecution, you have witnesses and testimony. So this deposition is some testimony from one of her neighbors. And Elizabeth Denham isn't saying she was a witch. She just said when this little baby, a 1-year-old Moses Godfrey, was sick, Rachel Fuller was just overly interested. What do you think's the matter with him? And then she did some creepy things like start calling her own child Moses after this baby. It was just weird. And that's all it is. She's just saying she did some weird stuff. Doesn't say which, but this is her testimony. So getting evidence from people, you had to write it down. So when we get to Salem, and this is a document from the Salem Witchcraft Trial, we have all these depositions because everybody's bringing in testimony. And usually it would be somebody else who would write it for you, especially for those teenage girls and the other ones. This is written by Thomas Putnam, who was the town clerk in Salem Village. And amazingly, the testimony from all these various teenage girls sounds exactly the same. So he was doing some of that himself. Now, this is a really good screen. Can you see that the ink up here is more brownish and then grayish? You know, you can see about there. This is curious. When we first started out, we were looking at things on microfilm and digitized microfilm, which is all black and white. When we started looking at the actual documents, things like this popped up. And I was at the Phillips Library with Dick Trask and Bernie Rosenthal, and we were talking about it. And when you go to archives, they only give you one document at a time. But if you've got 3 people there, you can ask for 3. So we asked for several different depositions, and I had digital images from other archives, and we discovered this change, this ink change, in a whole bunch of documents that were written by Thomas Putnam. Now, on one document, you could say, well, that's unusual, but you know, you hear whinnying and hoofbeats. It's a horse, it's not a zebra. But when you see it in 17 different documents, and they always start something like this. Also, on the 18th of May, being the day of his examination, this is one of the teenage girls, Mary Walcott, testifying about John Willard. He was one of the men. In just about all the scope of witchcraft accusations, about 25% of the people are men. And same thing in Salem. So here she said, on the day of his exam, I was most grievously tortured by him. I love grievously. During the time of his examination, for if he did but look personally upon me, he would immediately strike me down or almost choke me to death. I mean, his body is looking at her, and then somehow his spectral image is poking and choking her. So that's interesting. But all these documents, it's all that, on such a day being the day of their examination. Why? Why would this be so important that they would keep doing it? This is why. This is an indictment. An indictment specifies the crime on which somebody will be tried. And this goes before a grand jury, and the grand jury said, well, do we think we have enough evidence to do it? But they have to go through the grand jury, and this is the actual crime. And this is one of the ones for Rebecca Nurse. And again, you can see that they're two different inks. Most of the body of it is a template, a boilerplate. And then the prosecutor filled in all the specifics. And we have 4 of these. Boilerplate's the same on all 4 of them, but the different names and things like that were put in by the prosecutor. Well, when you say that somebody committed a crime, you have to say when they did it. Just about every single indictment names the date that the person was being examined. They were being indicted for a crime that they committed after being in custody, not for the supposed crimes that got them arrested. So that's why they had to add that to the thing. Now, they'd had incredible witnesses, the whole meeting house or whatever could see these things, but it really helped that the accusers were saying, yes, and on that date, this happened to me, and he did it.
Wait,
So-
I don't get it.
Yeah,
Why is there two, I understand the true colors, but if they were arrested
yeah,
and then they figured out that they were arrested for a crime that was gonna happen today.
no. They were arrested because of suspicious activities and claims of
But you
affliction.
said that the crime happened the day they were arrested.
The legal official crime that they are indicted for was for what happened after they were arrested and being interrogated in public. They weren't being indicted for the crimes of why they got arrested in the first place. She bewitched my cow. No, so they arrest her. They didn't care about the cow. They had witnesses because witchcraft is a crime that's committed in secret. So having it in public was great. It's really hard to prosecute for witchcraft because you need 2 humane adult witnesses to the same crime. So that's hard. This was easy. So once we get the formal charge, then we have to have, in addition to the testimony, we need to have more testimony. And this is, your reputation, you couldn't get away from your reputation. This is in the case of Eunice Cole, and they asked in 1673, oh, you know what? We have some stuff from 1656, can you send that over? So it will follow you around. And the fact that it says, somebody says copia vera, this one says vera copy, copia. It means a true copy. It's sort of like, getting a notary to say, yep, this is a copy of what we've got. So they were digging up stuff from the past because, hey, your reputation would follow you. And one of the things that they were finding there is that they seem to have found something that looked like a teat hanging from her breast because they'd taken off her top to whip her, and then they found something they thought was a teat. Now, what is this about teats? They believed that the devil, when making somebody a witch, would issue them a familiar, and some kind of imp or something. We know about black cats, but it could be a snake, a bird, a turtle, some kind of strange monkey-like thing, whatever. But it's the familiar would have to suckle blood from the witch from somewhere on her body, so they would search. Now, this is from 1853. It's a painting. Clearly, the artist was not there to witness this. And this is not what happened. This is a dramatic thing. Here, people fainting, oh my God, and they've taken her shirt down, and in front of everybody, they're trying to show where this thing is. Now, a teat could be anything. It could be a scar, it could be a mole, it could be, these are people from the British Isles. They're light skinned, they've got something growing somewhere. A blue spot, anything, it could be that. But they were searching them stem to stern, but they didn't do it in public like this. And there was Kirstie Alley was in a film about Salem with Shirley MacLaine playing Rebecca Nurse. And there's this scene where they've absolutely entirely stripped Rebecca Nurse in front of all the men in the jury and the judges and the ministers and stuff like that. I'm going, no. I think, that's Hollywood. Hollywood wants to show Shirley MacLaine's tight little tuchus from all those years that she was a dancer. You just see a little bit and go, oh, didn't happen that way. What did happen was the women would be taken aside with a jury of other women and the doctor and be examined stem to stern in private. and the men would be taken away to a jury of men and a doctor to look at them. And they looked everywhere, and guess what? They found teats. And in the case of these women that we get, Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, they found them in their private areas. And Rebecca Nurse was not very happy with this. She had 8 children that lived to adulthood. Who knows how many pregnancies she'd had. But she was saying there are no midwives on this jury of women. And these women do not know what they're looking at. They just don't. And she'd had a lot of kids. She could have had some tearing, scarring. She could have prolapsed uterus. I can think of all sorts of things that would, as I talk about my ancestors' private parts, but it's just sort of like, why do I know this at all? But she was saying, they don't know what they're looking at. It didn't seem to matter. They went and looked at them again, and they said, well, they've changed, but they're still teats. So they were finders of fact. Were there teats or not? So these other juries of inquest would come in, and they were just to determine these things. Also, you couldn't do any white magic. This is not from the Salem witch trials, but this is the kind of book that would have been circulating, would have brought over from England to reading palms. And we have a couple people in the records that were supposedly people who read palms. Samuel Wardwell over in Andover. Apparently there's a description of him, well, he would hold somebody's hand and look in and look into the air and then make some prediction. Dorcas Hoare in Beverly, apparently 20 years earlier, had a book, probably something like this, and her minister said, oh, you have to get rid of that. Well, 20 years later, we're in the Salem witchcraft trials, and he goes, oh, remember she had that book? Your reputation's going to follow you. It doesn't matter if you got better. So that came up. Other things, if somebody died, and there were a fair number of people who died, there would be a coroner's inquest. And that was a common thing, coroner's inquest, because if somebody died, you find a body floating in the river, you want to know if they drowned or not. And that's a pretty easy one. Does water come out of their lungs when you pull them out? But they had a lot of things that if there was an unattended death, the coroner and a jury, coroner's jury, would look. And little baby Moses, they didn't make it. So they had to investigate the body, and they came out and said, we find grounds of suspicion that the child was murdered by witchcraft. What were they looking at? They don't say, but they're a jury of inquest, and they come up with this decision. Was this child murdered by witchcraft? And they said yes. So poor Rachel Fuller. She basically was just scolded for taking too much of an interest in her neighbors. So the other thing you might have heard about is ducking. Witches float, innocent people sink. This is some woodcut from 1612 in England. That's Mary Sutton being ducked in the water. They did not do that in the Salem trials. Reverends Cotton Mather and Increase Mather said, no, that doesn't work. I'm thinking, how did they pick that one? All the other things, it's like specters, what? And it was sort of like, no, water itself isn't necessarily pure. The idea was that water is pure and it was rejecting the evil of the witch. Mm-hmm. And they said, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. But in the fall of 1692 in Connecticut, there were a couple of women being accused, and they did duck them. And here we go. She buoyed up like a cork. She swam upon the water. Oops. Now, again, if you like, Who Do You Think You Are? I like Who Do You Think You Are? I've been on it twice. Doesn't fall into my thing about documentaries. Who Do You Think You Are actually looks at primary sources, and those of us who are on the show, we have a set of documents to tell them the story. They're researchers, they read all the right stuff, talk to the right people, ask all the right questions. And it sort of spoiled me for the rest of these stupid documentaries. But there was somebody in this season whose ancestor was Elizabeth Clausen. And Elizabeth Clausen was not found guilty, but Mercy Desborough was. And in Connecticut, they said, yeah, we're not going to hang her. Let's make this go away. We don't have the record book from the Court of Oyer and Terminer. People come up with reasons for all sorts of, why don't we have it? Oh, maybe they didn't have a record book. They had a record book for every single court. I mean, these people, they wrote down everything. They say, well, maybe they destroyed it because they were so ashamed of it. No, that wasn't what it was either. Chances are pretty good that when they were doing reparations, they had to use that book a lot and copy out of it. My best guess is that it eventually fell apart. I think that's a lot more logical than saying, oh, they were ashamed and they got rid of it. No. But this is the first page from that Superior Court of Judicature, the blue line on the timeline. And this is the first page of it. And there's not a whole lot of anything that's new. You know, you don't learn a whole lot from the record book. Basically, you find out where it was, who the judges were, who was on the grand jury, and who was on the jury of trials. Then it repeats the indictment. We already got the indictment text. And then it gives the verdict. Guilty or not guilty. If you're not guilty, in 1693, a lot of people were being found not guilty, you were released upon paying your jailer's fees.
Okay.
Yeah, we're back there. And you know, you could be found not guilty, and you couldn't get out of jail until you paid those fees. And one woman, Lydia Dustin, couldn't pay the fees, stayed in custody, and died. Died not guilty in custody. So, if you were found guilty, you know, that's not so good. But our friend Eunice Cole, when they tried to convict her in 1673, you know, not legally guilty according to the indictment. They really tried to follow these things. They said, but just grounds of vehement suspicion of having had familiarity with the devil. So they knew something was up, but they couldn't convict her. Basically, she became like a ward of the town. At one point, they chained her into her house. They had different people taking care of her. The town paid for people to come and take care of her. Because, you know, mental illness in that era, what do you do? So she just was their town person. And anytime I hear Hampton going, oh, she's our witch, it's sort of like, no. You're a victim. You're a victim who really could have used more support. But if you were convicted, however, the penalty was death because it was a capital crime. And in all the colonies, when they had their list of capital crimes, you know, murder, infanticide, piracy, things like arson, talking back to your parents. Literally. I don't know anybody who's, oh, bestiality is in there. Yeah, all these horrible things. But the first one is always witchcraft. Always witchcraft. Whether, like, Rhode Island didn't go after anybody for witchcraft, but it's right there in their thing. So this is a warrant to execute Bridget Bishop. She was the first person who was executed in the Salem trials. And basically the top discusses, you know, why, you know, what the accusations were, and then it repeats the indictment again. And then it says to the sheriff, take the body of Bridget Bishop, bring her to this location on this particular date and this particular time, and hang her by the neck until she's dead. And then down here, like with that other, the arrest warrant, the sheriff says, yep, I have taken the body of Bridget, I've taken Bridget Bishop, I have to this place, on this date and this time, and I have hanged her by the neck until she was dead. If this is a topic that interests you, and you've seen things in recent years that we now have a memorial, I say we, Salem now has a memorial for the site of the hangings. A lot of people have just sort of, you know, one of those things you don't really know, top of Gallows Hill, that must have been where it was. Well, how do we know what we know? People like Tad Baker and Marilyn Roach and a bunch of other really amazing researchers have put out all the information as to why we already knew it, but it was on a ledge down below called Proctor's Ledge. And it was the kind of place that it was up there and everybody could gather and watch. You couldn't have seen things on the top of Gallows Hill. It would be too far away and you don't have a good view of it. Most of us who've been studying this for a while just sort of knew that. But if you're going to try and convince politicians that run a city to do something about it, you got to make sure that you dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's, so that they don't feel vulnerable. And there isn't somebody else going, well, yeah, no. So it turned out it was land that was still owned by the city of Salem. And they cleaned it up. It's behind a Walmart, a Walgreens. But they cleaned it up and they made this really nice memorial. If you've been to Salem, you've probably seen the big one that they built in 1992 for the tercentenary. But this is a very nice one, and the tour buses can't go there. You have to know where it is to go to it. And it's lovely. It's really lovely. But again, it's about where people were hanged. And a lot of people have these feelings about the people and their fates, especially if they have an ancestor, but not necessarily. Now this document, you can see there's that red splotch on it, that's sealing wax, and it's the personal seal of this guy. This is the chief magistrate of the trials, William Stoughton. And he, more than anybody else, is responsible for what happened. He could have changed the direction at any time. He really pushed for these things. I mean, he also wrote that warrant to execute those 8 people at the beginning of January 1693. Well, when Phipps said, no, we're not going to hang anybody, apparently he stormed off the bench and wouldn't come back. Yeah. So he was invested in this. Wasn't married, didn't have any kids. He loved Harvard, his alma mater. He gave Harvard £1,000 to build the original Stoughton Hall. This painting is at Harvard. Harvard loves him because he's lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, stuff like that. And they don't get caught up on the witchcraft stuff. There is no cache of papers or diaries or letters or any of those things. When people are researching people in the 17th century, they love it, found a diary, all these different things. There's nothing. There's nothing. And again, people say, why is there nothing? Oh, maybe they were so ashamed. I mean, people then weren't ashamed. This guy went on for another decade, have a really successful political career. There was no fallout for him. So why aren't there piles of stuff? Because he was clearly literate. He had a large library. I've only been able to find 7 books that came from his library. It's weird. Then I found out that the Harvard Library burned to the ground in 1764. I'm thinking, I can conceive of the family giving his stuff to the library at Harvard. That seems more logical to me. But then I also discovered that his mansion house in Dorchester is on a map in 1752, but there's no house there in 1831. So, you know, what happened to that house with his descendants? So I don't know that there's a fire or anything, but I'm seeing the 2 places I can think his papers would have gone. Something happened. So how do you write a biography of him? Well, with tweezers, and that's what I'm doing. I will be at Oxford, where he spent a decade in the 1650s, going there for a week in November. And I'm just doing all this little picking, so do not hold your breath for the biography, but I've got a pretty nuanced assessment of him, and I have, you know, people say, why did he do what he did? I said, you're gonna have to read the book. Because there's no thing like he said, yes, they all deserve to die. There's no single bullet. And I can explain why it happened and why he did these things, I think. But I need all of my background so you can read what kind of a man he was and why he would have done this and not suffered for it. So, yes, I said, don't hold your breath, but I'm working on it. By October, remember I said it was cold? And all these people are still in jail. Remember, they're just keeping them in prison during that time when October is cold. They're waiting to do things with them in January. So they weren't letting anybody out on bail. And finally, the people in Andover came together and they said, okay, we got kids there. I mean, in this case, Stephen Johnson was 13, Abigail Johnson was 10, and Sarah Carrier was 8. Yes, they had coerced them all to confess, so we got to keep them in jail. And finally, the largest landowner in Andover and their fathers came forward and said, we'd like to bail them out. You can see the little wax seals there. And what's it going to take? Because in the past, usually it's about 100 pounds. Rachel Fuller got out on bail for 100 pounds. They weren't going to let him. So what will it take? 500 pounds for these 3. There's another recognizance for 2 more kids. Those 2, 500 pounds. Then there are 3 more individual people, kids, including somebody who's 18 years old. 500 pounds for each of them. So to bail out these 8 kids, they had to come up with 2,500 pounds bail. It was outrageous. But you can just see that the people in Andover were probably going, okay, what will it take? Just give me a number, give me a number. And that's the only way I can explain why that's so high. By the time we get to December, they were actually letting people out on bond, adults for 100 pounds, children 50 pounds. So that's when they started going back to some normalcy. By 1696, we have Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, decides he's going to take the shame and the blame of it. hands a piece of paper to his minister in Boston and has him read it, in which he actually said he desired to take the shame and blame of the whole thing. So people know he apologized, and they go, but Stoughton didn't. This guy was he felt things, and we know that because we have his diaries and his letters and all sorts of stuff, and he had this huge family. And he looks all jowly and, you know, like a judge, stuff like that. He was the youngest member of the bench, because there'd be many judges on the bench. He was only 40 at the time. He was the most junior member. Stoughton had 20 years on him, so a completely different generation. But as the youngest member, he decided it was on him to apologize. People were realizing that something had gone wrong. Within 10 years, you don't really overturn a conviction in those days. You could get tried, convicted, and then you have a chance to appeal it. And if it doesn't work, then you get sentenced, and then you get executed. Well, once you get to that point where you're sentenced, something changes for you legally. You are attainted. Something called attainder attaches to you, and you lose all of your civil rights. Among those is, the sheriff can come in and take all your stuff for the crown. Not your land. If you've heard anything about land grabs, nah. You couldn't accuse somebody and say, I'm going to accuse that person of witchcraft and take their land. Land was completely different, but the sheriff could come and take all the stuff in your house, in your barn, everything, movable goods, and then sell them for the crown. So this in the attainder, people wanted that attainder taken off, because they were left with this conviction and attainder, and it could affect further things for them. So they were asking, can we take that off? And that's what the middle school kids did for Elizabeth Johnson Jr. Just get that attainder taken off. But another 10 years goes by, and they're saying, oh, what? We have some expenses. We want to be compensated for the thing. So this is the Wardwell family in Andover. Samuel Wardwell had been executed. He confessed. And then they said, okay, they were going to try him on confessing, and he said, oh yeah, I said that, but it's not true. You know, I was coerced. They hanged him anyway. So if you hear anybody say, oh, they didn't hang the confessors, they hanged him. Yeah. Anyway, but the family saying, okay, when the sheriff came, he took all sorts of stuff. All this stuff, so I've sort of written it out, but it really, this is my fun slide. Okay, 5 cows, a heifer and a yearling, a horse, and 9 hogs. Now that list doesn't really give you a sense that all that livestock. You know, this is one of my silly little slides, but when you look at that, you go, yeah, that's plenty of livestock for a decent farm. And then the sheriff took it all. Took the hay that was in the barn, took his carpentry tools. Now this is an illustration by Eric Sloan, but so it's more modern, but these are, you know, what hand tools are for carpentry. And that would have been able to give him extra income. Those are valuable things in the 17th century. They took the corn out of his field. It was September, that's when the corn is still up there. So he just took everything, and they said, you know, well, we want to be compensated. And this is what we want, 36 pounds, 15 shillings. Okay, and they gave it to them. But then they asked William Good. And it's a little different. He said, my wife Sarah Good was in prison about 4 months and executed. A sucking child died in prison before the mother's execution. She went into jail breastfeeding with an infant. A child of 4 or 5 years old, this is little Dorothy Good, was in prison 7 or 8 months, and being chained in the dungeon was so hardly used and terrified that she hath been since very chargeable, having little or no reason to govern herself. And he says, I leave it unto the honorable court to judge what damage I have sustained by such a destruction of my family. How do you make somebody like that whole? You
So the
can't.
little baby survived?
No.
No,
The
so,
baby died, the
Baby died.
4-year-old.
oh, the
The
4-year-old.
4-year-old is, yeah. So how do you make them whole? Well, they offered him 30 pounds. But, you know, you can't really, how do you come back from that? You don't. And little Dorothy Good, there are a couple of really wonderful researchers down at Salem who have looked into the rest of her life, and she was damaged psychologically. And the town had to take care of her, and she ended up never marrying but had 3 kids. I mean, her life after that is just horrific. If you go and look up History Camp Boston 2022, they did a presentation there and it's recorded. So I would send you in that direction, but she never recovered from that. So I hate to leave you on sort of a downbeat, but that's what real witch hunts are about. And I know I get excited and I love reading this stuff and stuff like that, but bottom line, people were killed wrongly. Families were destroyed. And if there's anything we're going to learn from it, we can't learn to predict evil and crazy. We just can't. And part of the reason you can't do it is that's part of what makes it evil and crazy. But we can look to see who helped, you know, Mr. Rogers. But the people in Andover really came together to try and oppose what was going on. And they finally said, okay, what will it take to get the kids out of jail? Things like that. And the lessons we learn from history are not how to prevent things from happening again, but what do you do when you find yourself in the middle of it? And the lesson here is that the town of Andover came together. Everybody was on one thing. They had a petition to get everything done, and they just really came together, and I credit them with being instrumental in ending the whole thing. They like it when I talk in North Andover. But I really do. I mean, the things you can learn are how do you respond to horrible things happening. Because anyway, well, on down note. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take questions. I answered most of yours, I think.
Well, no, I have tons.
Okay.
Let's go back to, like Hawthorne's grandson, Hawthorne, the judge.
John Hathorne.
Hawthorne is,
Yeah, it's spelled H-A-T-H, and his descendant is Nathaniel Hawthorne, and there's a W in it.
so did Nathaniel add the W?
Families change spellings over time.
But he hated his grandfather. I grew up in Concord, and we heard that
Yeah.
his grandfather.
Well, he had issues. He had issues trying to deal with it, and he tried to work them out in some of his writing. You know, some of the stuff about in the House of the Seven Gables when they're just sort of going around, and the main character is, you know, coughing up blood, and then there's that story, which is not true, that Sarah Good said, God will give you blood to drink. You know, all sorts of really crazy things were said about the trials and the people in the late 1800s. There were plays and poems and stuff like that.
So the judges didn't benefit from this, though?
No, they were doing their jobs. Nobody really benefited. The Crown, because
Well, no,
they
the
took all
sheriff
that stuff.
sounded like he got off pretty good.
Well, but that was his job.
To take the cows and all that.
Yeah, and then sell them, and then the money goes into the public coffer for the Crown. You know, people say, oh, he was bad. Well, he might have been a SOB when he was doing it. You know, it doesn't mean he was a good person, but it wasn't to keep it for himself. So, yeah.
What's your sense of the judges and the legal people?
Mhm.
How deeply did they really believe in what they were accusing these people of, or was it just the generally accepted way to deal with problems?
It
in
was
society?
generally accepted that witchcraft was real. The devil was real. The devil could have pacts with individual people, and it was sort of an inversion of the Christian stuff. You know, you have your when you're doing a covenant to join your church. Well, the devil would have his pact, and you would sign in blood. So it's sort of this inversion of what they already believed, how things worked in the world. This was just so. Now, what you used for evidence to prove it, those were debatable. And the stuff about the spectral evidence, there were people who said, I can't do that. But there were other people who said, yeah, if you are guilty, your image comes through as in spectral form. But other people said, well, you know, maybe an innocent person, the devil could be impersonating an innocent person, because he's the devil. So that was a big bone of contention. So there's a lot of discussion going on as what was credible evidence. And clearly they threw out the ducking But the notion of spectral evidence, whether the devil could impersonate an innocent person, was a huge point of discussion. And they took these things really seriously, clearly.
Another question, so I thought that the witch trial, they smashed them with rocks.
No, there was one man, Giles Corey. The legal proceedings on how to bring somebody to trial, they've been indicted. You go to the bar and you plead, guilty or not guilty. And people were pleading not guilty. There were 4 people who pled guilty. They confessed and they said, sure, and they were getting ready to hang them too, but they didn't because of the governor stepping in and not hanging them. But Giles Corey, he was about 80, and everybody was trying to do something to screw with the process. And in those days, when you pled not guilty, they would ask you a formulaic question called, do you agree to be tried before God and the country meaning represented by the jury? And you were supposed to say yes. And then you would go on to your trial. And he said no. Because he knew that these trials were everybody was going to get convicted. And so he said no. And they, what do we have to do? And they got this thing from England. Nobody else had ever done this in America, but to put them under stones, it's called peine forte et dure, and to put a board and lift stones and put it on top. And you don't get crushed by that. Your lungs can't expand and you can't breathe. And so he was executed that way.
So he's the only one?
He's the only one. And it's the one that everybody knows about. It's crushed to death. You know, it's grisly. It's what the heck happened there? I also have an explanation that'll be in my book about why it happened.
How long do you expect to write your book? How long? Next week?
I'm using tweezers. I'm using tweezers. I don't even know what I'm going to find. I mean, Stone spent a decade in 1650s England, and I don't know if you know much about your English history. I had to learn about the English Civil Wars to do this, but Cromwell was right in there. And then at one point they had, the Parliament had executed King Charles I, beheaded him, and then King Charles II wasn't very happy, and then when Cromwell died, there are all sorts of things. But Stoughton was in England during the time of Cromwell and King Charles II reclaiming the throne, so it was a really interesting period of time, and I've had to learn all about it. And now I'll spend a week at Oxford in November and see what they've got in their archives. So I'm hoping to find some more stuff, but it really has been looking at other people's lives and seeing if there's any connection that way. I sort of have to put him in all of these things. So any reference to him in Samuel Sewell's diaries, okay, good, okay, he liked chocolate. Okay, good. And I don't know if it's on display, but there is a sterling coffee pot made by Boston's most famous colonial silversmith, John Coney, a chocolate pot that came down from his niece. And it probably is the piece of plate, they call it, that he put in his will to give to her. So, and then there's this account in Samuel Sewell's diaries that, you know, they liked having chocolate and venison. Massachusetts and Mexico on the same table. So it's interesting to find these things from other people and then try to structure his life. But it's a challenge, and nobody else has done it, and I'm retired. So that helps. I mean, how do you follow up this? And there's so many books out there, and there's so many plays and presentations. There's all sorts of stuff out there. And I said, well, what am I going to do that nobody else can do? And I have the time. So that's why I want to know about Stoughton. It's his seal. Where did that come from? How come he had a wax seal with his family crest on it? I have answers. But and then his personal seal was used on the warrants to execute people, not the court seal or the town seal. So, good question. So anyway, I'm happy to take more questions.
Did anything like this, obviously this was the most famous, but did anything like this happen in any of the other colonies
Oh, yeah.
at the time?
Like I said, in the fall of 1692, Connecticut had stuff. There was a whole spate of things in Hartford and Springfield. There were actual witchcraft charges and trials all through the English colonies. including Bermuda. Bermuda had a whole bunch. That looks like a trip. Research trip, yeah, I'm gonna go down there. Then I found out somebody had already done it, and I went, but she only put a chapter in her book about it. It's like, okay, that's another time, but research trip. But, yeah. Thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
It went a little long. Thank you. And if you want to take a look at some of the facsimiles, just hold them in your hand rather than just seeing them up here. Feel free to take a look over there.
We have some evaluations if people feel like they'd like to do that. I'll